Hi there, welcome to the Cyberhut TV. My name is Simon Moffatt, founder and research analyst at the Cyberhut, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be sitting down again with Jeff Hickman from Ori. Jeff, how are you doing?
Fantastic. Wonderful to be here, as always.
Not at all. That's good. Good to be chatting. This is the sort of third part of a set of sort of interviews and chats we've been having over the recent time, and trying to unpick some of the core issues, I guess, with homegrown and isolated manual identity and access management. Some of the sort of key drivers and needs to move to this productionization of identity. I think a term one of us spun up recently, but this productionization of identity is really, really important, where we have this repeatable set of standards-driven capabilities, which can deliver for B2C, B2B2X, and obviously maybe things like agentic as well. And we've sort of talked a little bit about some of the pain points and some of the things to, I guess, look for if you are considering sort of productionization of your identity platform. And in this, I guess, quick chat, we want to sort of uncover a little bit about how we can get there. Obviously, we talked a lot about the sort of pitfalls and issues many organizations have around maybe open source, or maybe one or two isolated components, things haven't been joined together, or maybe they've sort of built something and it isn't scaling or it doesn't have those future requirements. And then
Yeah.
they understand they need to migrate to something different, production ready platform, be that maybe it's maybe they're still building it themselves under an enterprise license, or maybe it's a more of a managed, sort of external offering there. We'll maybe touch on that a little bit as well. But we want to sort of the journey, I guess, your prospects and customers go on to make that reality. One of the sort of things I've sort of underlined immediately in my Kindle here is the need for flexibility, I think it seems to me, because not all identity projects are the same. Even if you talk about sort of B2C or B2B2X, each project and maybe even each sort of app within a project is going to have different onboarding, different authentication, different Auth2 federation style requirements there. So I guess the key part to me would seem to be, if you are thinking of migrating, flexibility and having options, it seems to be a key part of it. Is that fair?
Oh, I think absolutely fair. Yeah. I kind of, for years, we've had this kind of phrase and saying, I think across all parts of software is rip and replace is terrible, right? Replacing, having to rip something out and replace it with something new, something that no one ever wants to do. It's always a headache. And so having the flexibility to come in and maybe be a little bit more surgical about migration or upgrading or changing things out, I think is a really powerful ability for any software to have. I mean, that could be things from, desktop antivirus software to things like DLP or even VPNs, being able to gradually migrate people over across all walks of software, especially at the enterprise side, is really powerful. I think consumer identity and access management, or B2B2X, or things along those lines, is even more interesting, because you're also not just trying to juggle like the management overhead of your team internally making that change and scheduling that workout, but then you're also trying to do it without disruption to your end users, right? And without noticeable impact to their experience and their flow, which kind of adds this other angle to it, right? Which is, internally it's hard already, right? But now we also have to be conscious about, can we suffer 2 hours of downtime while we cut something over? Is that acceptable? Or can we have the experience change? Or something that I always tell people to watch out for a lot of times, and it's not an easy hurdle to get over, but a lot of identity solutions require you to like redirect users out to their platform to validate or things like that. And that redirection can change. And sometimes that's jarring for people. We've been so hyper focused on protecting people from like phishing, right? That some users, and still unfortunately not the majority of them, I wish it was, but some users get hypersensitive when like a redirect changes, right? And they go, this doesn't look right, right? And that could also be an impact. So there's a lot of things, and if you're not able to, if you kind of have to do this whole big rip and replace, man, that's tough usually on the end user portion of it, for what they're going to experience and what they're going to feel on that piece of it. Unfortunately, us employees, we can kind of like deal with it, right? And like, yeah, that's part of the job. You got to build it out, but
you can whinge and complain. You absolutely spot on. I think the end user, certainly B2C end user usability it's so transparent if identity is working effectively for them, if they're trying to make a purchase, do something online, etc., etc. And it is really transparent if it's not working. And I think it often doesn't work at multiple parts of that life cycle. You talk about enrollment onto a system, and that can be clunky in the sense of trying to collect all of this sort of self-asserted information, your first name, your last name, your high school, your favorite color, your pet that you had when you were 10, all this sort of stuff. But obviously then once you get over that hurdle, you then got things like login issues, step up authentication, credential reset, offboarding changes, terms and conditions, all of those different things, which you're absolutely right. You may, I guess, as an organization, have spent several years building what you think's an optimal flow. And it's almost, you want to sort of take the best bits of what you have and somehow augment and, I guess, transfer that onto the new world.
Yeah. And I think this is, that kind of transition is really, I've been at a bunch of different stages of companies, right, that had different consumer facing portals and things like that throughout my career. And one of the things that I've always come back to is like, look, there's the easy button from an end user experience perspective. It's the out of the box, maybe some minor, you can put your logo and change some colors and stuff like that. And that does, check the box, especially when you're building something and you're kind of just trying to get things out there into the market. But there comes an inflection point around user experience where it's almost like harkens back to kind of build versus buy to a degree of, do you just offload that work, right? Are there platforms that are flexible enough to achieve your goals, right? From an out of the box, experience. And I'm using a very broad term for like UX, user experience, or customer experience around here, CX, I guess, on that side. Or do you go and build it yourself, right? And I think that's a really interesting trade-off that a lot of companies, like for us, that's when they're kind of maturing to that point, right? Where they're like, yeah, it's nice that you have that hosted UI. We can use that. Maybe we can use that for a year as we kind of, transition. And then maybe we're going to build ourselves something. And I think that it can't be understated in identity. If you want to be able to keep that customer experience the same, whether it's SIAM or B2B2X, whatever it is, being able to build your own UI on top of that experience across whatever vendor behind the scenes is really powerful. Because the other thing that we don't know, and this has happened time and time again, is what is the business going to change on us from a technology perspective? What are they going to require in 6 months that's net new that maybe your vendor isn't ready to support, right? Or maybe, maybe it's even things like we saw, I remember last year when Cloudflare was doing the bot blocking for LLM scraping and stuff like that. We had a number of customers that reached out and said, hey, we know, you guys use Cloudflare and part of your service, are you guys going to be bot blocking and stuff like that? And that level of control of being able to say, hey, it's my domain, my user experience, I can choose to block here or not, rather than relying on a vendor for that type of stuff as well, is really, really critical to CX. So it's kind of like multiple things, right, around like the flexibility and ownership of that user experience. It's hard. Don't get me wrong. Building user experience and customer experiences is a hard job to do it right and to do it well. We try to make it a bit easy with giving, SDKs and stuff like that. I know a lot of vendors kind of have that methodology behind it. But really it comes down to also how the identity solution is not just from a vendor given to you, but how it's designed inside of your network, right? And how or as infrastructure really at the end of the day inside of your in your organization. And we've seen this a lot with I think the pain point comes not, I would normally gravitate to like, hey, you're coming off another vendor, and that's like a pain point for that. But interestingly, it's actually more of a pain point for Homegrown, for people who have built their own identity solutions. And I think the reason for that is people who have been using an identity vendor for years are used to working in the confines of the vendor gives me X. Everything else the business needs, I have to build around it already. So they're mentally kind of in that position. Versus Homegrown's like, hey, we've built everything and we've just added it on additively. And so it's an interesting split. Sometimes you think it'd be the other way, like, hey, the vendor part would be a harder migration because you're locked into stuff over here. And there is that. Don't get me wrong, that happens. But really, the Homegrown story can kind of be a little bit more difficult to adjust and reframe from a customer experience standpoint, at least. Because, sometimes it's just the all-in-one, right? We've built the whole, it's so integrated into our app, there's no way we can separate it from it a little bit. Yeah, fragile.
Yeah,
exactly.
Very fragile.
Exactly.
And that then introduces, also talking a lot about sort of the customer experience there, but also there's the sort of developer experience and the sort of admin experience or the config experience there with that as well, because it's very fragile, very difficult making policy changes, or maybe things like testing policy changes, and it's just becoming really, really complicated. We touched a little bit things like data sovereignty in the past and PII, but all the runtime authorization, and that becomes difficult if it is embedded in and it's fragile. That suddenly becomes, I think it's often an overlooked or an underestimated complexity point really around if you are building homegrown authorization, embedding things in. It may well work for some very simple use cases, but you're going to hit a brick wall pretty soon, I think, in that sense.
I agree.
So
I agree. I also think it's opportunity though right now, just with the market, with the developer experience stuff, being able to, and like we have this old kind of conversation and identity that comes up a lot. Is like, look, your developers shouldn't be wasting time rebuilding off, right? There's a lot of reasons why. I mean, outside of the whole entire "don't roll your own crypto," I think "don't roll your own auth" is like right there with that from a statement perspective, just because it's such a highly sensitive thing. But at the same time, like there's people who've been doing this for years, right? From an identity standpoint, we kind of understand all the bits and pieces of it. What are the common pitfalls? So it's like going to a vendor for that makes a lot of sense because it's something that, one, it's not necessarily hard, right? But it's intricate. And there's a lot of moving pieces to it. And there's a lot of understanding and stuff like that. But I think that's where the developer experience stuff and where the market's going starts to get really interesting. Because as companies are going to be relying more on things like coding agents, right, and LLMs to help kind of facilitate that, the ability to say, hey, what is the best practice from a developer experience standpoint to do, what's the best practice as a developer to do this, right? And asking a coding agent to do that. And the coding agent can be super informed about whatever platform or thing you're using to make that super easy. My hope is that over the next, 6 months, a year, 2 years, that becomes less of a challenge, the developer experience. And that it's a foregone conclusion that, hey, like no matter what thing we go with, it should be easy to integrate to our stack and remove the mental load. And I think that will be interesting because I also see a lot of people rolling their own auth with the LLMs, which is scary to me, on that side. But we'll see what happens with that piece of it.
Well, yeah, I agree. I think roll you on everything is suddenly in focus at the minute. I think it's it is easy maybe to build something as a POC, but
you start talking scale and which I mean, look, it's fine. Again, it depends where you are, right, as a company. If you're starting to get something out in the market quickly and you just need to validate and say yes before you go back, like the old MVP argument, is that good enough? Yeah, potentially. But then you get things like, with Anthropic, with the whole next generation model and Glasswing and all the kind of like threat stuff that kind of is sitting in the back of your mind as a product and security person going like, maybe we should take an extra moment to cross the T's and dot the I's.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily dive into that now, but I do wonder if ironically the things like Mythos and the Glasswing thing sort of will it amplify the vibe coding because you think, oh well, I can just test it with Codex or some other AI to test what. I don't know. It's all again back to the robot wars. AI is creating something. AI is going to secure it. It's just going to compete. But it does actually bring me on to a sort of segue question, really, where we are talking about homegrown, custom, manual stuff there. And I think migrating it seems to be there's two pathways there. One is, okay, we can take what we have and productionize it with a license model there versus that managed service cloud, outsourcing the risk, if like. I just wonder, do you have any comments there around how different are those sort of journeys? I'm thinking things like skill and how you maybe decide whether to say, actually, you know what, we're going to just get a commercial license and still have the control and build things versus more outsourcing, for want of a better word, or leveraging more of a managed sort of cloud delivered model.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really boils down to how integral the identity and the customer experience of that like authentication, authorization, permission level journey is to your business, right? And I don't want to say that any specific company is, it's less important. I think it's equally important across the board, but there's different levels of how much it impacts what you're doing. I'll give you an example for this. If you're like a media company, right? We happen to work with a bunch of different large media brands, global media brands that have a bunch of different, aspects to them. Some of them are just pure publications. Some of them are sites where you can interact and have like a community around it and things along those lines. For them, the authentication and the customer experience of that is like integral to everything they do, right? And so having a hosted experience for that, it's difficult because it can't necessarily always be directly integrated, right? Though I will caveat that because a lot of media brands are interesting because they have so many different brands in it that some of them can deal with the hosted and some of them want to control the end-to-end piece of this. So being able to kind of be flexible around that. I think is important as well to be able to address, pain points across the board. But then you have other, companies out there like if maybe you're like B2B2E, and maybe in a sense, or maybe you're just selling to like enterprise customers, right? Where the login experience is employees at some other enterprise, right? And maybe you're a security software that maybe there's a security team, maybe from a single customer, maybe it's 100 users who are logging in, right, at a given time. You're not doing the kind of like consumer focused numbers, right, where we're talking like these massive amount of users, hundreds of millions of whatever the thing is the identity piece of that super integral to the experience that they have. A lot of cases, yeah, a lot of product people I think would say yes, right, regardless in this case. But I think that it's easier to make the trade-off on knowing your audience, right, of like what their expectation is. And some things are simple in that case. In that, enterprise case, maybe it's just SSO that you need. And the experience is really simple. And maybe a managed service can handle that for you. And great, you're done. It's gone at their IDP anyways. There's not really a whole bunch of impact on the customer experience. So I think it's really important to understand the audience as well. Like we just use this blanket term, IAM, right? Or B2B to X, but that X on the B2B X, I love that because it's like, that's so important to understand who that audience is when you're looking at what's appropriate for how you're designing things. And I think also too, like, don't be afraid. Like there's not necessarily a misstep, in this space too. I think a lot of people get into analysis paralysis around this of like, what's the right move? And sometimes it's just making a move that's a better move, regardless. Maybe it's not optimal, right? But based on what you have, resourcing wise, what you're available to do with the vendor that you've chosen, things along those lines, sometimes just making the move is the right start. And realizing that all this is a journey, right? No product is 100% complete, right? Everything's always building. And your identity kind of fits into that. It's kind of why lately I've been on this kick in the back of my mind about identity in general. And this idea is not new. It's been bouncing around the industry for a while, but like identity really should be treated as infrastructure. It's something that is growing and changing as your business grows and change. It's just like if you're going and deploying services to any of the IaaS, right? The cloud vendors, say, Amazon or GCP or Azure or whatever it is, right? Or Entra on those sides, right? It's when you're doing that, there's new features that are being leveraged there. There's new capability you're taking advantage of as your business is growing. Things like new regions, dynamic scaling, things along those lines that from an infrastructure perspective, you just take advantage of. I almost really think we should be treating identity like that infrastructure layer, right? Where it's like, hey, you might be starting, maybe you're I don't know, let's take AWS as a starting point. Maybe you're just rolling ECS, like compute, right? And that's where you start. It's a jar file because maybe you're building in Java, right? With on a fixed server in ECS, right? And then as you grow, we need scale and we need multiple pods. Okay, let's go to Kubernetes. Let's containerize, right? So now we're in EKS, right? And you kind of have this evolution. I think identity, really, we should start looking at it like that as well. It's like these starting points, these areas to build, and something that offers you this as a service, right? To be able to say, we can offload some of this, great. And then also being able to, when you get to that point of maturity, right? I know for a lot of companies, like take databases, for an example, when you get to a certain level of maturity, what's available on the IaaS, on the cloud platforms, may not hit your specific use case. You might actually need to go a layer deeper, and you might need a more specialized database vendor, right? That might actually be able to offer capabilities that the IaaS can't. So like, I kind of see a lot of similarities in that world, and treating identity as an infrastructure that grows and can adapt and can move into that is, I think, really powerful. And a lot of our most successful customers, to be real, like from migration standpoint, that's how they kind of look at it. It's a set of capabilities that's part of their infrastructure. You'll hear this a lot with organizations that have a lot of brands that they're managing or a lot of applications they're managing. They always want like this idea of a centralized authentication hub type of thing at the end of the day, where everyone's pulling into that. They can have control. We don't want app dev team over here to make permission changes in their app. We want it to do in this SOA or whatever architecture they're pinned to. That screams to me infrastructure. Like that's what you're building. You're building an identity infrastructure. So I think that's an important way to look at it. But that is sometimes against kind of how people think about services, like managed services, from an identity standpoint. I don't think you have to. I think you can use both. But really, if you want to start treating it like infrastructure and operating that same way, having a platform that gives you that flexibility is super important. on that side.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think flexibility is the key, and I think because identity has become so critical in a whole work of enterprise use cases, not just the B2C, but security and data and all the rest of it. I think being flexible in how it works from a modularity perspective, I guess that's probably the reason. You guys have a lot of individual modules there. You Hydra and Keto. It's nice and modular, like the Lego brick approach, so you can build out. 'Cause each customer will be different. And I guess I want to sort of wrap up a little bit and talk a little bit about what does that end goal look like? So the journey to get there is going to be as flexible. You are looking at pain points, you are modular, whether it's going to be sort of fully controlled or maybe it's more of a managed service style delivered angle there. But what does that end point look like, where it's migration to a productionized platform has worked? So clearly there's going to be operational benefits there, things that are hopefully standardized using whatever, Scheme, Morph 2 and all the rest of that sort of stuff. But back to the things like UX, you've got end user improvements because you're likely to have consistent experiences across multiple brands, multiple apps, multiple federated entry points. You've probably got huge consistency for dev, for administrative experience. You've probably got compliance improvements. It seems to me there's a lot of benefits there. I just want to wrap up and just hear that in a little bit more detail, I guess.
Yeah, I think being able to look, if we go and look at just over the past year of customers who have gone onto the platform, I think it's really interesting. There are some that have gone full stack, right? Pulled everything in and gone that route. But the majority of them have been able to, what they've liked is been able to pick and choose the points that are currently painful and go along a migration path to completeness. Some of them are still in the middle of that journey 6 months later, right? And it's not I think that's also why I harken back to the infrastructure conversation, because that's not a bad thing, right? Not having necessarily like a full end state, right? Because this is something that's constantly evolving, right? Obviously, you don't want to be in a state where you have, 5 years down the road, you have 6 different identity vendors and you're still in the migration process. But as far as capability and getting to that final stage of evolution of where your identity's at, that's an ongoing process. So when we look at a lot of our customers, what they might start with is they realize, look, our problem today deals with permissions. We got to solve the permission issue. Fine-grained authorization has been a plague in the identity industry for a long time, right? It hasn't been perfectly solved. And so being able to just pull that piece in and solve that, great, you're one step closer, right, to being the full ecosystem. So if we look at kind of just where customers sit at on that side too, a lot of the homegrown customers, that's the easiest path, is just to start pulling the pieces in and going, right? Now, customers who come off of existing other identity solutions, right, like they're coming off of maybe a full stack identity solution, maybe one of the legacy vendors, or even some cases some of the newer vendors who have popped up. I think it's interesting. They're a lot more in the mentality of just replace the full thing and get to that complete stage at that piece in time, at that point. And what we see, if we go back to some of our customers, maybe 2 years we onboarded, they've done that. And then they've grown as companies too. And now they're at the point where they're like, we need to do that next level. And that's where they now have the flexibility to maybe they want to self-manage it, right? Maybe they don't want to have it as a service. Maybe they want to bring it in-house and pick the specific pieces. So you can see that even in our own customer, this macro trend that I'm talking about with the industry, you can see that within our own customers on that side as well. I'm not sure if that answers your direct kind of question there, but just kind of, we see that line of evolution as users go through.
It does. I think it's nice because there is definitely, I think, in B2C specifically versus B2E, sort of workforce identity, there's a lot of uncertainty, first of all, because you're not quite sure. You may hope, I don't know, an online service has millions, it's hugely successful, like OpenAI or whatever, but it might not be the case. And you have to sort of plan ahead and think, well, okay, let's start with, I don't know, a user repository and some basic single sign-on. But then, as you said there, the uncertainty maybe, well, actually, the scale of this could become huge and it could become viral, or the complexity of the use cases suddenly ramps up. So you may start off in, I don't know, you build an app in America and suddenly it has to go into Europe. And then you've got all this privacy stuff to deal with, data sovereignty, replication, PII protection. And suddenly that uncertainty, you may not have known that's where that was heading. And I think it's very different to workforce, where you have an authoritative source, you have an HR system, you sort of know how many people are coming into PeopleSoft or whatever every month, and it's a nice churn and blah, blah, blah. I think certainly in B2C, there's uncertainty and there's uncontrollability. There's things that you just cannot control, which sort of amplifies your point around, you may start on a particular area, but then you might branch off and say, actually, you know what, we need to have the gateway stuff, we need some federation stuff, we need single sign-on, we need permission management, and it sort of expands, I think, both technically from a capabilities point of view, but then obviously you've got that scaling thing around more users, more systems, and so on. So I think there's definitely, back to that flexibility thing, you need to have that sort of matrix, time progress matrix, and maybe start small, but also you mentioned something interesting about maybe starting at different parts of the organization. You know, as you say, it may start on permissions management, or you may start on improving UX and branding. So it sounds to me you can often start at different points, I think, which is a good thing, I think.
Yeah. And I think you've outlined that really well, of kind of making those trade-offs and where to go and where to start. And I think that that's a pitfall that we can get into sometimes around identity projects, is that on the requirements of today for your identity project may not be the requirements in 6 months. And that's tough sometimes, because it's hard. You don't have a crystal ball. You can't really predict the future, to your point of someone going viral or something like that. Maybe you're a new product and you post on Hacker News and everyone loves it and just boom, you blow up, right? Great. The challenge with that, and we saw this real time with the and we're seeing it kind of real time with one of them, with the LLM, the major AI providers, right? I mean, if you remember 3 years ago, right, when you were dealing with OpenAI, right, and you were trying to log in when they launched a new model, right? I don't know if you remember this, but going through that experience, I remember this, and this is before I was at Ori as well, but I remember trying to go in and not being able to authenticate in, and there being issues, right? There being hey, you go to the authentication piece of it, you would maybe that would be successful from the initial credential, but then actually getting the token or session or what have you back into actual chat, that would break. Or maybe chat itself was overloaded and it couldn't handle the request, or whatever the deal was on that side. And they had an existential challenge with that, right? And this is well documented. We have case studies around this. And part of the problem is that they chose initially a vendor who was yes, it checked all the boxes for today. The one box that was left unchecked was, can this, and there's multiple things with this that they want, that they wanted to do, but one of the check boxes that was left unchecked was, how well can this thing scale to web scale? And arguably, yes. I mean, I think any identity system at the end of the day can scale, but there's factors that go into it of is it economical? Is it optimized? Is it, so on and so forth. You can throw hardware at anything and get it. I mean, we're seeing this with the AI vendors. Throw more GPU at it, right? You can scale on that side until you hit the eventual, hardware limits of just no hardware. And I think identity kind of goes in the same place in a lot of people's mind, but there's so much optimization that can go into things like scale, data sovereignty, usability, customer experience, and stuff like that, that sometimes if we choose a vendor that maybe checks the boxes today because we don't think that, hey, scale is going to be a problem, then what you're stuck with is in 6 months, if you do hit a new scale milestone that you need to get to, then you got to rip everything out and replace. And you're then in this perpetual cycle of hey, I can't use that vendor. I got to replace it. So I really always stress to a lot of customers who come out yes, your requirements are here, right? And that's fine. Pick there and sit there, but try to look at a platform that's going to allow you to continue that scale so that you don't have to retool, 6 months down the road, a year down the road, 2 years down the road. Is that, maybe for your business, because we talked about the enterprise, piece or the workforce piece, maybe that's your audience, and great. So you can pick something that's small and just only handles that. And yeah, you might have a lot of organizations in there, but that's a low amount of users. So maybe scale is not a huge issue. Great. You can use a vendor that can handle that. But, understanding where you eventually want to be, I think sometimes that's underrated for the sake of the current project that people push into, which is a really interesting point. And it's hard. I'm not saying oh, it's easy, just pick the thing that scales and great, because you're not at that scale right now. You may not even have the budget to achieve the cost for some things to get to that scale. But I think that people get scared of scale a little bit. And I'm harping on that. I apologize, but they get scared of scale a little bit because they instantly equate in their mind hey, there's an increase in cost of the number of identities, these things and stuff like that. And I would argue that it's not, you don't have to pay for scale now. You just want to make sure that you have a platform that can deliver that when you get to that point. Right. And it may be, 5 years down the road until you're to that point and you have to worry about it. And great. But That's a decision that I would hate personally, as if I was an engineering manager, to have to make once something changes in the organization, and then now all of a sudden I got to change everything again.
Yeah, I think there's definitely, I think that uncontrollability and the uncertainty, it does play back into what you're saying for land. Start small, modular, be adaptive, be reactive, because you have both the business requirements and you've got technical changes, whether it's the platform changes, external security threats, you've got compliance requirements to be adaptive there as well. I think to me, just jotting down that final success stuff, it is trying to say, look, trying to make it, absolutely operationally more streamlined, cost effective, but also things like cost predictive as well. Because if you've got a homegrown thing, there's a whole host of costs there, tangible and non-tangible. You've got staff, delays in making it live, which then has knock-on effects to how the business operates. You've got infrastructure costs and all the rest of that. And it's not predictable. Whereas actually, if you do have a productionized platform, yes, I'm not saying it's going to be not going to go up in cost. It may well, but it's predictive as the business grows and the use cases grow, which I think is important. But I think as well, because you have that uncertainty around maybe users, use cases, external requirements, you can future-proof to a larger extent, because you do have that modularity, trust, and confidence. Actually, well, you know what? We're going to start with the repository, but then actually I can see I need a bit of Hydra, I need a bit of this, I need a bit of Gatekeeper, I need a bit of other things going forward. I think that gives confidence, doesn't it? I think if you have a productionized view of the world, which it isn't just right, there's a set of use cases really narrow, and to break off that is going to be complicated and expensive, and there's a cost involved. So I guess, to me, it's as identity becomes critical to many organizations, it seems a no-brainer to me to move, as you said, don't roll your own identity. I think is becoming a bit of an adage that even with the rise of Vive Cobras. But I guess any last quick little thoughts there, Jeff, before we wrap things up?
No, I mean, look, I think, I think that there's a lot of different choices, and I feel for people having to look at the identity space and kind of trying to make decisions and where to place bets. There's a lot of choices out there in the market. And I think one of the big things that I just stress to people is look what gives you and what you think is going to be enough flexibility for the future, right? And what gives you the control. I think that's the other thing, the other kind of underlying piece of this, and flexibility is buried into that, is sometimes when we look at a piece of software, right? Software vendors can be opinionated, right? And they can say it needs to be X, Y, and Z. It needs to be this way. Heck, even Ori can be opinionated. We're pretty adherent to the OAuth 2 spec for Hydra specifically, and we don't deviate much from that, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes that can be a trap, right? Too, for an organization. If you go with something that's super opinionated and you relinquish the control, right, to make those decisions that your business needs to make, that can be tough. So I usually, just would urge people to, hey, look at what systems gives you that control, that flexibility to deploy it how you want it, how you need it. And then something that has a track record to help you scale, right, if that's going to be in your future as well on that side. And then the last thing, I think we didn't touch on this at all, but it's really underrated, but it's just the ability for a company to work with you as a partner rather than as kind of just a vendor giving you a service, right? I think that's really important. And that's such a hard thing to judge. Like, I can sit here and pontificate all day and tell you, like, hey, we're, I'm fantastic to work with. Great. You come with Ori, like, you're going to work directly with me and my team. I'm a delight, right? I could do that. But every vendor is going to have that same type of piece. So, really kind of look out there and talk to your peers, who's worked well, who's actually partnered. And sometimes partnership is not always getting what you want. Sometimes it's being told that maybe that's the wrong way to do it and stuff like that too. And here's maybe a better way. But I think that that's an understated part of this as well, as just the reputation of the vendors, of who's able to be there to support you, to work as a partner, to listen to your needs and build those things in as well, and kind of just understanding all those fun sort of stuff as well. I think so that control, that flexibility, and really the ethos of actually having a partner in this rather than someone who's just giving you a service at the end of the day.
That's a really great place to end. Yeah, partnership. I think identity is now, it's a partner with your customers, it's a partner with your business model, it's a partner with delivering what you do. And I think it's, our partnership with the supply as well. Jeff, thanks for spending a bit of time. There's this whole host of things there to unpick. It's really, really good to sit down with an expert to get some of your insights. So thank you for sitting down with me. Thank you to our audience for watching, and we will see you next time.